Okay, so
Cool.
welcome, Julian. So the thing is, the library can actually not ask questions probably. So we have a lot of people online that are maybe going to chat, and we need to read out the questions because there's no microphone. It's a bit clumsy, but I think we're gonna manage. So yeah, I think so yeah, we are thrilled to have Julian Bleeker with us today. So he's a creative leader and he has a PhD in technology, and he's, I think, a world-leading expert, you can say confidently, on design fiction. So we are thrilled that he's here with us today talking about design fiction, so his field. And it's really relevant to IDE because you're just starting your projects now. So Julian,
Mm.
welcome everyone, and thanks a lot for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. So just so you can hear me okay. Yeah, just okay, cool. You never know these things. Okay, so I just want to share some thoughts and perspectives on the practice that I think we're all here to discuss, which is design fiction, which is it kind of it captures a lot of different approaches and practices to doing design and thinking about possibility and thinking about and actually creating the future and futures. And so I just want to go through some reflections on that, and then hopefully leave some time for some discussion. And of course, happy if there are questions while I'm talking. If they get teed up and queued up, they often inspire sort of further conversations around this. So I encourage questions and thoughts. And let's see if this is going to work. All right. So here we are. You can see that futures design chat. Okay. So I just need to make sure that this works on my end. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly do a little bit of my background just to kind of set a little bit of context. So my background's in engineering. Let me just put this over here so I can see you in case something goes wrong. Okay, so my background's in electrical engineering, and I did a master's degree in also in engineering, mostly focused on user experience design and um, virtual reality, basically, at the University of Washington. And then I did my PhD in the History of Consciousness program at the University of California in Santa Cruz. My focus was on technology and culture, and I've come to realize that it was really on focusing on the way in which we our our consciousness has developed around our relationship to technology and how it sort of shapes and informs us as social beings. Subsequently, I kind of bounced around quite a bit, and I think that was because I was trying to find a place that felt like kind of like home, where I could bring my imagination to the work of creating essentially products, things from possible worlds, and so that kind of varied between doing it when I was at IBeam, doing some work there as a kind of arts practice. So art and technology were two things that could kind of go together. And then teaching at the film school at USC. So essentially telling visual stories about things was my focus there. And then I spent quite a bit of time at Nokia working in an advanced design team. Again, still trying to figure out ways of investing time and energy into thinking about the future as it might pertain to creating products that might be from the future, at least as a commercial entity like Nokia thought about the future. And then when Nokia kind of imploded all over itself, I started a company called Amada, and that was a proper product company, and that was both a desire of mine as an engineer, really wanting to build a product, not just a prototype of something, but actually something that could introduce itself into the marketplace. And my experiment in this context there was to think about what it would take to create a product that felt like it was from someplace else, like it didn't quite make a whole lot of sense, but that could exist and sort of shape people's perception about what a particular archetype of a product could be. And it's super nerdy, but essentially it's this, which is it's a bicycle computer, but it's got an analog display but digital electronics on the inside. And I won't go into too much of that now, but you can see a lot on my website and the Amada website. So here was my question: what would it look like if you could do design and fiction simultaneously? And this was, I realized, was kind of like my thoroughgoing question through all of these endeavors, and trying to find the way to do that. Sometimes I knew that I was asking this question. Sometimes it just occurred to me in hindsight, actually, that's what I was doing during that time. And so when when I was in Los Angeles, I became friends with this guy, Bruce Sterling, who happened to be doing a residency at Art Center College of Design, which was across town from where I was teaching. And I learned this from him, which I found like absolutely fascinating. As he was studying what it is to be a designer at Art Center, he had this question: design and science fiction are sister occupations. And I found this really provocative because I was still learning about what design was, and I had a good handle on what science fiction was, but I didn't understand how design and science fiction could be sister occupations until I really kind of allowed that to kind of soak in through conversations over the years with Bruce. And so I asked him this: is like, can you do design as science fiction? So can design be a way of telling essentially a story of possibility that's sort of grounded in material culture, but as a kind of speculative take on what could be? And so I kind of waited for his reply, and he said, "Sure, why not? Just call it design fiction." And I remember this moment because it sort of made sense in a way, like you could create this new practice. Let's call it design fiction, and let's make it a new practice, not because we just want something new, but because we're trying to think of these two previously disparate practices as together creating something new, a new mix, like the DNA from both intertwining itself in order to create just a new practice. New not for the sake of being new, but new for the sake of wanting to look at and understand and make sense of the world in a slightly different way, in a way that's different from science fiction on its own as a literary form, and different from design as it was understood at the time, like 2005, 2006, as something that was in the service of more in service of the imagination than in service of structure, like companies and that kind of thing. So I was curious about how these things could come together, and so I kind of wrote this. And this was my sort of slightly overthought consideration about what these things all together could be. So a short essay on design, science, fact, and fiction. And this just allowed me to essentially get all my thoughts on a page, and use that as a platform for evolving and developing what this practice might be, and doing it in collaboration with a great many other people who were also asking similar kinds of questions, and also looking for an evolution of a practice that felt like was timely. There was a moment in which we kind of needed a new take on what it was to think about, in particular, the future, or what's next, or what's adjacent, or what could be. Okay, yeah. So why do this? Well, it should be. It's quite plain to me, and it's probably plain to you, that the way in which we see the future is of a type, and it's very hard to push outside of that type. The archetype of the fantastic future that is always slick. It's always sort of represented according to a particular set of conventions and stylings and all these kinds of things, which are compelling, and they kind of signal something, but they're also quite constrained. So the world is either going to be fantastic in the future, or it's going to be like a smoldering mess. And it felt like we could use other possible archetypes for representing the future. So you have things like this. You have the hype cycle, which is a favorite go-to for trying to, for those who are looking to anticipate what's next. It's often very much it's tied very closely to things, and to things that you're going to try to figure out how can we extract some monetary value out of these things, and then the future also oftentimes kind of looks like this on the one hand, like very clean, like there's no disorder to it. It's all kind of perfect and almost kind of fascistic, and there's lots of blue kind of see-through displays, doing kind of inscrutable, generally poorly designed things, but it signals something, lab coats and all that. And so the question still remains, like, why do fiction and design together? What's going on there? And there are some really good reasons. So Ursula Le Guin says the future is a safe, sterile laboratory for trying out ideas. And it's a means of thinking about reality. It's a method. And this is something that I really am drawn to, the idea that you can prototype possibility and doing it in a way where you're not prototyping just a product, but you're prototyping the world that you might be immersed in. You're prototyping the sort of full experience. And then Samuel Delaney says the variety of world science fiction accustoms us to through the imagination is training. It's a way of thinking about the actual changes, often confusing that the real world funnels at us year after year. And I find this quite powerful as well, this more expansive notion of what it is to, or what it could be to prototype, that it's a way of kind of testing our assumptions and creating a context, something that you can really immerse yourself within, as can happen when you have a really well-written novel or story about a world. You really kind of, you fall into it and you end up dreaming about it in a kind of longitudinal way. And I want to be able to create things, experiences, design fictions that operate similarly. But do that as an artifact, not as a prose-based fiction. So this is our current working, definition, I suppose, of design fiction. It's the practice of creating tangible and evocative prototypes from possible near futures to help discover and represent the consequences of decision making. So the emphasis here I would draw your attention to is the tangible and evocative prototypes. So there's good understandable confusion that design fiction are stories about things. And I would make the case that that is not what design fiction is, or that there's a disadvantage of focusing on prose-based fiction. And the disadvantage being that, hey, but wait a minute, what about things that are made? Can they have like a place within this realm of imagining possibility? So can you create objects that effectively imply a world, or that effervesce a world, that are evocative by virtue of their materiality, by their form, by their either existing or supposed functionality, by the context in which they're set. A material object, just to be plain, like a piece of material culture, which is very different from a story about material culture. And I would say that a story about material culture has its place, and those are really important. But that's actually science fiction as a literary form, as a prose-based literary form. And maybe in some cases they're like, in some contexts they're like, I don't know, scenarios, or kind of user journeys, or their explanations of functionality. And I'm really talking about design fiction as what, in like a product, closer to product design from some future, that where you have an object that essentially effervesces the context from which it came. It's the object as a symptom of a set of circumstances or a culture. And so this is one way just to kind of get that point across, is to imagine design fiction as existing in this context. So imagine a time-traveling archaeologist, right? So these are people who study material culture from past worlds. A time-traveling archaeologist who brings found artifacts, weird scraps, shards of pottery, fragments from the near future back to the present, where we unpack what they say about the world from which they came. So imagine that the near future laboratory has a kind of crappy, not very well designed time travel machine, and it's leaking some kind of oil, and there's a little red warning tag on a button, and that tag says "Do not press ever." There's another little repair notice, and you can get into this machine, and it's not very good. It's not quite perfect, so you're not quite sure where it's going to take you, and when it's going to take you. But you get into it, and you go to a particular adjacent world, or a future world, or however you want to think of it. And when you get there, you only have a few moments to gather stuff up as if you were an archaeologist. So you might end up in a living room, you might end up in a retail store, you might end up in someone's bedroom, and you're trying to imagine the things that you might gather up. And when you gather those things up, you quickly jump back into the time travel machine because you don't have really a lot of time because you're not sure when it's actually going to bounce back and the battery's running low or whatever. And when you come back, you do as you might imagine an archaeologist on a dig from some Roman ruin someplace where they just sit there and they puzzle. They're like, I have no idea what was going on, a little bit, but maybe this seems like this thing came from where food might have been prepared, and what might this artifact have meant, or how might it have performed, or who used it and under what circumstances. We ask those questions of these things that we brought back, and we do it in a very partial way. So we're not coming back assuming that we know everything about this world. We didn't get a chance to spend hours and hours talking to someone from this world. We didn't get to talk to social or political leaders. We didn't get to talk to people who work in this world. We only bring back the object. And then we're meant to infer what the world was that this object existed in. And so these are design fictions. So in another context, you might imagine, I guess maybe more of a, the approach to this is if you're doing a project and you're trying to feel your way into what a future might look like, you might do a whole bunch of research about existing trends, things that are going on in the world. Essentially, the kind of future of work is what you're trying to do. You're trying to understand where the world is going in a particular context. So the example that I'm offering here is like we're just trying to think about the future of food. And in that, you're just kind of doing a bunch of desk research. You're looking around, maybe you're talking to some people, trying to understand what they think the future of food might look like. Where are things going in the trend line? Where are scientific developments in food? How are tastes evolving and changing? What are the constraints that are being put on food production in a global context? All these kinds of things. You might gather all this material. And then you might stop there and say like, well, here it is. This is what it kind of looks like. And you might synthesize this in the form of a write-up, just like the conclusions. Here's all this research. Here are the major themes. Here's what I think or what could be or where things seem to be going. And you kind of tidy it all up and put it in a 3-ring binder and say, here, this is my future of food report. And that's pretty hygienic. That's the kind of work that a lot of future forecasting will do, or trends forecasters, or these kinds of things. So there's your report. There it is. It's got a bunch of writing. It's got some trend lines and pie charts and that kind of stuff. I'm like a I guess certified product guide. Like I like material artifacts. I think that they're incredibly powerful ways of opening up the imagination, of a thing through which you can imagine a world. And so what I might do is I might take all that stuff and say like, you know what, I don't want to do that report. I don't want to write all that stuff up and synthesize it and do a bar chart. That doesn't feel very evocative to me. There's nothing very exceptionally visceral. There's no vivid representation of what this world is. I'm not opening up the imagination. I'm sort of making a statement about what the world might look like. Now that might be useful. You might have that, but also I want something else alongside it. It's like, I want a box of stuff. I want that the collection of things that me, the archaeologist from the future, has brought back from this world, the things that I start to imagine when I'm reading all these reports, that I'm sort of feeling into this world and trying to bring some of it back in a way that plays on our, I guess, there's something about the human consciousness that is drawn to a thing, not just words about the thing. And I want to do more of that. I want to bring the imagination into this equation, and I want to bring it as part of the conclusion. I want to show this world. And so I might say like, you know what, I'm going to do a box of cereal. Yeah, you might get the 3-ring binder with all the reports and all the synthesis and the bar charts and all that kind of stuff, but you're also going to get a box of cereal. And that box of cereal might be as effective, if not more effective and more imaginative and more visceral way of representing what that future world might look like. And it might be a box of cereal that implies certain changes in the world, certain changes in the way in which food is considered as a part of material culture and part of like food culture. It may have an evolution in the way in which the networks of distribution and manufacture are organized. There might be new brands that appear. There might be new sensibilities that can be implied just through that box of cereal. And you might be able to actually do some incredibly imaginative work to synthesize all that research in this bit of material culture. And this is what I would refer to as the design fiction. This is telling a story, but through a thing. An evocative object containing lots and lots of knowledge, lots and lots of implied aspects of the world, lots of openings for people to kind of participate in asking questions about and opening up the realm of possibility that doesn't have the same conclusion that a period, a full stop at the end of a report does. There are probably more questions here than there are conclusions, and that's good because we want to have those conversations to think about possible worlds. We want to give people the opportunity to ask the questions that are kind of lurking beneath the surface. So you have things like, okay, it's made with cricket flour, right? So insect protein is now a core component of some food products. Monsanto is somehow involved with something called a bioscan. Again, this is something like, I don't know what the bioscan is, but it feels like it's of a world. And it can open up a question because someone's going to ask, oh, what's bioscan? Like, good question. Like, let's try to understand what the different attributes and characteristics of something of this sort might be, such that there would be something called bioscan. I literally don't know, but it feels like it's something that could belong there. And that's part of it, is giving yourself as the creator of design fiction, as the essentially the futures designer, the space to create representations from the world that don't necessarily have to be complete. They're openings for questions and conversations, and we're provoking and evoking considerations and dialogues with stakeholders. Okay, so some other examples of design fiction. So this IKEA catalog is something that we did with a research team, including some people from IKEA, to think about what the future might look like as represented through the archetype of the IKEA catalog, which is something that has a particular resonance, and using an archetype that is evocative, that some people can feel into, that they recognize at like almost every level, both the brand and sort of the visual design of it provides this point of entry, and it makes something feel like it belongs in the world. And I think that's an important aspect for design fiction that I've learned, is that if you can make it feel liminal, if you can make it feel like it's something that could possibly exist in the here and now, and open up that, create that, I sometimes refer to it as the double take moments. If someone sees it and they're like, oh yeah, IKEA catalog, but they're like, wait, what? What's going on here? And that wait, what moment is where the conversation opens up, where you have that little bit of, kind of beautiful cognitive dissonance, where people are like, whoa, what's going on here? And you want that question, the whoa, what's going on here? You want people to kind of refer back to that entry point into that future world, where they begin to wonder, and they start having a dialogue, which opens things up, and that sense of wonder that comes from something that says, wow, this is kind of crazy. Like, what? This is something that I wasn't expecting. This reflects a certain kind of creativity and imagination that I think draws people into the conversation. So here's a spread from that. It feels all like everything's, oh yeah, okay, I can't, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Like, look at this guy. One guy's like tapping on something. He's got VR glasses on. So it's the kind of thing that just sort of opens up that. So rather than, you're not fetishizing virtual reality as oftentimes most futures stuff would do. I mean, Google Future and virtual reality, and you're just going to get a lot of kind of blue line drawings and people wearing helmets and looking aghast at the world and in wonder and that kind of thing. But you're just making it normal. It's just part of the world itself. There's nothing unique going on, and even you can see on the armrest of the sofa there's a little a something or another, and maybe it's referred back to you in the description of the sofa. And then this guy, Ari Birnbaum, you look at him and say, oh, it just looks like a pitchman of some sort, but he's actually the data wealth king. So what is that? Data wealth? What's going on there? And so you start opening up, and why is IKEA involved in it? These little kind of nudges into what could be. Some more things from the catalog. So, there are different kinds of new materials of some sort, carpets made of moss. Is sort of tipping things into something that looks like something that could exist, but what is going on here and why is this happening? And so those again places where those questions are kind of opened up. This was from another project that we did with IKEA at the end of last year, and so this was the this was a rather very large set of research that we kind of decanted down to in one case a particular product that we could imagine IKEA participating in this system of home gardening, and actually gardening edible food. So the idea here was there was twofold. One was to actually create this moment in the form of an IKEA advertisement. At the same time, this sort of fit into an IKEA publication that they did. It was circulated internally, but it's a public it's a public synthesis of a very large research project that they did, and they actually did it as a kind of magazine that represented the research, but then also nudged into it this ad in the center of the magazine, and then there was after that there was a reflection on why they did it. What was the point of doing design fiction within an organization like IKEA? And the conclusion was, sort of, as you might expect, to help imagine and sort of synthesize a lot of very large societal sort of impactful considerations about what the world might look like and what IKEA's role in that was, as a way of kind of representing and internally discussing and evolving some of these considerations. There was another design fiction. So we were asked by the city of Geneva to consider what should they be considering about the world of autonomous vehicles, and this was a few years ago, and we decided that we were going to actually create a physical map that you might get when you arrive at the Geneva airport. So essentially just a very hygienic tourist map of some description that would represent the city. And so we took an existing city map and we just did a bit of a sort of internal seminar to discuss what might be some of the contingencies that would arise in the autonomous vehicle world, and how would those be represented in a map in a very hygienic way. So if you start digging into the map, if you start reading it, there are a couple levels down that you can go to that imply some of the considerations. So, for example, here you can see that, oh yeah, I mean, there's going to be a mix of different modalities. There's going to be different kinds of traffic. Some vehicles will be autonomous. Some vehicles will be manual. There'll be different kinds of routes and rides that you need to be aware of, and there might actually be some roadways that are reserved for one or the other kind of vehicle or mix of vehicles. There might also be places where autonomous vehicles have difficulty operating because, kind of being slightly medieval city with lots of weird roadways in some parts. These might be considerations that the technology cannot successfully negotiate. So it might be forbidden to have an autonomous vehicle on a particular route. And so you can find ways of representing the kind of insights that you might have when you have like a kind of open discussion, or you're doing a seminar on a particular topic. There might be a little nugget of a thing that, yeah, sure, you could just kind of write it up and say it, or you could translate that into a form where it can be represented in a way that expresses that idea, or expresses that consideration or that concern, as if that concern were exhibited in the world. That you didn't remove it, you didn't ignore it, but it's something like, we're going to have to deal with this. So, deal with the issue of maybe roads that are like quite crowded with autonomous vehicles, and how do you how do you respond to that? You could either do the kind of typical Silicon Valley thing, saying like, well, we'll figure that out, or the algorithm will make it better, which is often not the case. Or you could say like, yeah, now we're kind of saddled with this problem, and this is how we anticipate it being represented. And you're doing that because you want to anticipate those problems and represent them, and give them a voice in the future, give them a representation in the future, without in this kind of tangible way that opens up the conversation that oftentimes is difficult to have in any other form. I consider, so TBD catalog was a project that we did. I can't even remember, 2014 maybe, something like that, maybe 12. And I consider it was like the first time I really focused on testing some of these ideas of how do you represent the future through material culture, through designed artifacts. And I consider it sort of the canonical design fiction project, because I think it represents so many of the different aspects of what it is to do design fiction. And the product catalog still, for me, remains like one of my favorite archetypes, because they're just such rich things. Not embarrassed to say that I collect product catalogs of different sorts, because I think they're a way of reading culture, put it plainly. So just some spreads from the product catalog. Again, this was the fun thing about this is that we weren't trying to predict the future. We weren't trying to be, say like, hey, we figured things out. We have this special technique for anticipating what the world might look like. But it felt like we were sensing into where things were going, and we could do it in a way that was lighter, much lighter than trying to make a prediction or doing the Gartner hype curve thing, saying like, this is where things are going. I'm not really into that kind of, doing the future to be the person who predicts and somehow can see into the future. That just seems like a very uninteresting game, and I just don't have the ego for it. So some of the things that, that were just sort of on the cusp, like, like Bitcoin. I mean, it's a thing now, and it's fraught and all that kind of stuff. But at the time, it was just kind of like, it was just this weird thing. And it wasn't so much that we thought that it would become a big thing by any means. It was more like, what would the world look like if this kind of trended? And there's a lot here that anyone could have represented, but we decided to represent it, I guess. Like, so we weren't playing the game of trying to hedge the market. We're just saying like, well, it seems like hardware for mining, whatever that is going to be a thing. So like, let's see, let's just sort of say that this will be part of that world. And then, like drones, of course, were a big deal. And this idea that you could have a dog walking drone seemed to, like a mix between the end of the dog walker human and more like the drone thing seemed to be fun. And then, of course, also playing with ways in which you can anticipate that that sites of manufacture might shift. So the dog walker droid AV hybrid is made in Costa Rica. Now, I'm not trying to say that Costa Rica is going to become a place that will make dog walking droids, but I am trying to say that you never know where, how the world can evolve and shift, and sites of production might change. Now, there's one way in which you could say like, well, you got it wrong, because there are no dog walker droids near as I can tell, and Costa Rica hasn't become a site for high-tech manufacturing. But that's almost beside the point. It's more to say like, okay, I hadn't really thought about these kinds of changes in the world. And then it just kind of goes on. And I think from a visual design perspective, creating these kind of rich representations, like these things where you just want to kind of immerse yourself in all the little details of how these things are put together and how a catalog works. And it really requires, like the fun part of this, and most of it is fun. The fun part of it is really identifying the key components of what goes into representing a product and then doing the work of actually representing the product. So there's the idea, but then when you really dig into it, as if you were someone who is producing a product catalog, you got to get into all the details, the way in which product SKUs are represented, the product descriptions need to be of a particular type and style of textual description. You need to have things like callouts that are representations of reviews, pricing, the ways in which pricing works. Are things just a price, or are they scaled pricing depending on when you fund it? All these kinds of things are the rich details that go into this, and that's really where the work is anticipating all aspects of the way in which material culture has evolved and changed, including things like that, the little itty-bitty details. So if you just stop at the idea, you really haven't done the design fiction. You've come up with the idea, but then you got to run it through in whatever archetype you're going to use, whether it's a map, whether it's a product catalog, whether it's a quick start guide, whether it's a maintenance manual, all those kinds of things, or like a receipt, all these kinds of things. You have to really kind of dig into the details of it, and that's really the telling the story and as a bit of material culture. Okay, so I just want to two more things. One thing, I want to talk about what I think of when I think of a futurist, and for me, it is being able to see the world in a way that other people either dismiss or never really thought of. And for some reason, I get stuck on Alex Honnold because he saw a possibility where no one else was willing to see possibility, or very few people were. And whatever was going on in his brain, he was able to see something and a certain level of commitment to it and kind of pushing through to it where it was not seen or anticipated. And I think that's one of the core traits of a futurist. I'm not saying climb without ropes, but I'm saying in a sense, maybe, metaphorically speaking. Dick Fosbury was an athlete who I consider in a way a futurist. He saw the high jump in a way that others did not. So he developed, invented the Fosbury flop, which was a way of kind of clearing the high bar that was seen as just not right at the time. So previously, people had jumped straight over, like doing a scissor kick, which seems a little bit ungainly, and he decided to go after that in an entirely different way. And I consider that kind of futuristic. Like, he saw something that didn't exist and created a window through which people could understand and see what he was doing. And he won a Olympic gold medal. So wheels on luggage is another little kind of metaphor that I use, or story that I use. Like, what took so long for them to put wheels on luggage? Seems kind of normal now, but it wasn't until 1972 that it was actually patented. And there's some stories and descriptions about when the first person put wheels on luggage. It's almost like, I guess, a little bit less interesting, but the main point is just to be able to see something that is anticipating a new form of, in this case, material culture, that now we look back on and think of just, well, yeah, what took so long? Like, why were people lugging luggage for so long? Another favorite example is jogging. If you can imagine, there was a time when jogging was a weird thing, like people didn't do it. And Bill Bowerman, who was one of the founders of Nike, and he was a coach at I think it was Oregon State University, or maybe University of Oregon at the time, a track and field coach. He introduced jogging, but to do it, he had to write a book explaining it. Aside from very many other things, but the book became a platform for actually telling the world, like, there's this thing, it's called jogging, and you can do it. And so he had to create these almost like instructions for what it was to jog. And these are beautiful books. I mean, just on their own, when thought of in that context. I mean, they're showing you things that now is quite routine, but at a time it's like you wouldn't do it. I mean, there was, if you were a runner, you went to the track to go run, and it was very highly specialized. It wasn't something that, oh, anyone can do it. And you can even, just these wonderful, they're pictures of, essentially, at the time we referred to them as housewives, essentially like running in housecoats with a something covering their hair so they don't get their hair wet. It's a really beautiful kind of moment where there's this transition, and he's looking for ways of representing that and making it feel hygienic, normal, like this is something that everyone can do. And these wonderful descriptions. It's free, it's easy, it's relaxing. It can be done alone or in groups, like providing these points of entry where people can be like, okay, this sounds like good. It's good for the heart and lungs, the organs which may determine your lifespan. Like all, essentially like the early days, he's trying out the ways in which you can get people into this and understand it and adapt it, make it part of them. I think there's something about normalizing it, again, making it kind of hygienic so that people can feel their way into it. That's really well represented in this particular example. So just quickly, the last thing I want to do is try to situate where design fiction is amongst a spectrum of ways of looking into and translating into the future. And I just kind of situate here. This is a graph that my friend and kind of speculative design colleague Elliot Montgomery, he put together this graph that didn't quite have all this detail that I've put in, but I've built on what he's built. And so I see this spectrum from the things that we do to understand and make sense of the world, make meaning of the world, running from art on one side to like more structured methods on the other side, which is right here, it's just put down as strategy and policy. Might need to evolve that. But on the structure side, you've got all these different ways of essentially making meaning, of making sense of the world. You've got things like market research, you've got ethnographic research. If you're in a corporate context, there's direction that you take from your board of directors. There's whatever the latest trending business book is that's shaping your way of making sense of the world, of understanding what could be and understanding the way in which you interpret opportunities for your business. They're TED Talks, right? Those become like these really heavy signals of like, oh, what's next? Or what's a really cool idea that someone's evolving, developing. There's financial modeling, which can be very easily considered to be a kind of fiction. It's just a fiction done with a spreadsheet rather than with a designed artifact or a research report. Financial projections, the quarterly advisory, market analysis, all these things that kind of are getting closer to, I guess, less evidence-based things. There's like user research, qualitative research, trends report, there's design thinking, and as you get closer to the kind of middle between the imagination and structure, you get things like design research, design futures, exploratory prototypes, you get speculative design, of course, production design when you're kind of getting more into the realm of visual storytelling, visual translations of culture into a cinematic form, futures design, all this kind of stuff these are all ways in which we do epistemology, like we're trying to understand how we know what is and what could be. And these are all just different forms of what we might say anticipating or exploring or pushing into or trying to imagine into the world. And if we go to the other side, we have things that are much more where things are built with instinct. We rely on our imagination to express and translate and represent the world. Art can be looked at as a way of making meaning of the world and interpreting it through these expressive forms, whether it's sculpture, or whether it's oil on canvas, or whether it's an event or a happening. They are things that tap into our sense of feeling, our sense of dreaming into the world, but they're ways of making meaning. They're ways of making sense of the world. Sometimes more difficult to understand. Sometimes it requires us to, just like you might have to go get an MBA to understand a financial model, you might have to get an MFA to appreciate the historical context and the expressive context within which ideas in an artist's imagination are translated into various material forms. And so for me, design fiction fits in between. it's a way of variously bringing the imagination, so the expressive art feeling sense of things, closer to structure, closer to ways in which the representation of my imagination has a kind of materiality that feels like it exists in this other world. So one design fiction that I did during the pandemic was my company Amada. I created an annual report, which is very high structure kind of artifact. It's a material artifact that exists. You can see them, you can get them. Every company does an annual report saying what they did for, and where they're going. And I did one, but mine was from the future. So I took the imagination that I had for the future of the company, and rather than doing it as a PowerPoint deck to pitch to investors and that kind of thing, I did it in the form of, this 80-page annual report from the future. It's the thing that I genuinely imagined writing in the future about what we had achieved and what we had done and the products that we had developed in the future of the company. And that became the artifact that I used as a design fiction, but that was legible to the audience that I was talking to, essentially like investors and people who are very much more on this side of things. Like they want the PowerPoint deck, and I was like, I'll do you one better. I'll give you an annual report from the future of the company, and that way you can feel my dream of where this place is where we're gonna take the company. Okay, that's it. And then if you're interested in more, there's my Linktree thing. We got a podcast and we have a book coming out. The book's coming out hopefully in a few weeks. I'll stop there. I hope you heard all that.
Thank you so much, Julian. I think everyone is blown away, and the podcast is really amazing. I listen to it actually every day on the way to college. So thanks a lot.
Oh, awesome.
I'm going to open now the floor for questions. I think we also have a big crowd online. We also have a lot of speculative designers in the IDE crowd. I don't know if they're listening at the moment, but yeah, please feel free to ask Julian any questions. Either you unmute us directly or you post it in a chat and we read it out. It's also possible. Maybe they're a bit shy, so I'm gonna maybe kick off with one. Julian, what makes for you a good design fiction in a way? What are the certain qualities? It feels like it needs to be somewhat close to home, but not too close and not too far away. How can you make a sense of it? What's a good prototype that feels somewhat intriguing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are you could if it feels like it could be, that's a good measure for me. If it feels like it's something that I would expect to see on the side of a bus, a metro bus, or something that I might see in a magazine, if it feels like in that kind of territory that is making it feel, I guess to a certain degree, a little bit out there but plausible, is where it exists for me. And again, it's, I think, back to that, if there's an allegory, the imagination and structure, if you can bring one to the other in a way that feels like, all right, this feels like this is of a particular world. So I think that idea of it feeling either imminent, if it's gonna make me do that kind of double take, like, wait, what's going on here? I think that's also a characteristic of it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have also questions here from Viraj. I don't know, Viraj, if you're here, shall I read it out to you, or do you want to unmute?
I could do it. So, hey, Julian, I suppose we've spoken briefly before on the Discord, on which I'm as well. But I wanted to ask you, while working on client projects, design fiction can be seen as playful, experimental, or dare I say, not useful, because it belongs. I mean, there is value in provocation, but one could argue that provocation may not be as valuable as actually creating objects that belong in our lives right now. So how do you approach such a situation, or if someone has such an outlook?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's no. So I think how you handle it is, well. I think there's there's a lot of work together. I found is quite helpful. So rather than just kind of taking, going away and then kind of bringing something back. I think I found that it's helpful to kind of work with the main stakeholders throughout and involving them quite directly in the kind of development of the context and of the ideas. And I also think doing a lot of work explaining and helping them understand what the purpose of the design fiction is. So it's not to define a specific product roadmap. That's a different kind of design work. It's to help them imagine the world in which they might be existing, or their service or their kind of product ecosystem might exist. And so it's more like the production design in a film, like the elements, like the props around in the world, which might not be telling the story itself, but they might be useful to setting the context for the story. Absent any production design, or production design that is deliberately austere, you're focused very much on the story itself as opposed to the world in which the story exists. So you imagine a very, some kinds of theater, for example, will dispense with props, or there'll be one prop. And that is telling a story in a very particular way. What I'm trying, and which is maybe closer to, hey, we're just going to focus on what it is that we're going to build. I don't want anything else. I don't want to know about society, culture. I don't want to know about the contingencies. I want to know about kind of ecosystems of products that might exist alongside of it. I don't care what people are eating for breakfast. I just want to focus on the thing. And then you're going to get a very particular kind of output. I think in the context that I'm interested in working, it's like, let's set the full scene. And it's also to say that design fiction isn't a replacement for other kinds of work that might need to go on. So you might still get the 3-ring binder. You might still get the summary of the user, kind of surveys that were done, but you'll also get a box of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
Some further questions in the chat, but maybe Sandy, you're here as well. Sandy, do you want to ask directly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Julian. So as you were answering that question to Viraj, I was just thinking about my nephew, actually. He's 2 years old. He can't read, he can barely walk, but the future is his. So I guess my question is, how could babies become futurists?
It's a really good question. I think babies probably already are futurists. They just don't know how to tell us yet. I think at some point what happens is we are, I think this is rather sort of unfortunate that in a lot of the context in which we're educated to make sense of the world and make meaning of the world, at some point, maybe it's around like 5th or 6th grade, we're effectively told to stop imagining and kind of figure out what you're gonna be. And I think that's particularly unfortunate. I think that one way in which design fiction, or just these general approaches, I don't want to overemphasize design fiction, but ways in which we imagine possibility needs to be re-emphasized. Like I imagine a world in which we have, you've got history, you've got civics, you've got sport, you have your music lesson, and then you have your how to imagine class, at 5th period with Mr. Larkin or whatever, like where you're actually taught to emphasize and understand what it is to think of possibility and to imagine into the world. And it's something that I would really like to create in some contexts. I'm not saying create a whole curriculum, but actually I would love to do workshops with young adults to bring up this question, like let's talk about what it is to imagine, or let's imagine possibility, and doing it not as a way just to kind of dream and ideate, but also as a skill, as a pragmatic approach and mindset, just as where you kind of develop your sense of what it is to you develop your mathematics mindset. You understand the world through mathematics or through civics or whatever it might be. Being able to do that with the imagination, I think, could be powerful.
Thanks.
Sure.
I think Irene has a question. Irene, are you there?
Hi, yeah, I'm here.
We can't hear you. Can you ask a question? I think your audio is a bit quiet. You want to type it?
I think we're looking into like speculative. Can you hear me? Oh, you can't hear me.
Oh no, it's okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
Oh, so I was just asking about speculative design projects. If it's not fictional in basis where all we're creating is anticipating what is to become the new part of the material future. But if we're actively trying to design a solution that we want to employ in the future, but like how do we address for the fact, for example, our group is doing something about speculative, the future of work, metaverse working, but like how can we take into account that maybe in a few years the technologies we designed around these design interventions will become obsolete? How do we account for like technical advancements within that area where our design wouldn't be rendered obsolete? I think this is something that's really hard to predict and really hard to like fully consider. I wonder like what are your views on how to balance that?
Yeah, so I personally I would suggest just removing the prediction part of that consideration. So don't try to predict because, but rather I would go through that exercise of getting in that time travel machine, the crappy one that doesn't quite work well, and go to this world and see what are some of the things that you would bring back. And I would also look for things that are maybe not directly related to what you perceive of as the solution, but sort of the other things in and around it, or the other kinds of experiences that you might imagine would exist in this world. So, like an archaeologist, but rather than digging into the past, you're digging into the future. What are the things that you might find? And I get what you're saying, but I think you're trying to find the answer. And what I would say is like find some of the material around the questions that you're asking. Like what is going on in culture. So imagine what an advertisement would be for a lawyer in this world. Imagine how people are what they're eating for breakfast. How are they ordering groceries? Like these kinds of things that would, technology, you can focus on the one thing, like, which is, like the phone or whatever, or you could focus on the things that people do with it and how they experience and how they maintain themselves as social beings at every layer, and see what happens there, and just bring back some of those props from that world. So imagine that you're actually just kind of collecting things of that world rather than the thing that the question you're trying to solve. And that way you could actually luxuriate in the what was the word? The obsolescence. So play with that. Like, so what are people selling at on eBay that has become obsolete that somehow people still want? Or what is going on at the secondhand shop, or the pawn shop, or what are people throwing out now? And what is the municipality saying about, please dispose of your VR headsets properly, or something like that. That sort of imply some of the questions that you're asking. So don't try to answer them, but put them out there as things to be represented as a little, municipal notice that appears on on someone's door, saying, that, or, a fine that someone gets for doing something that they shouldn't. Or again, back to this idea of like the used repair shop, where someone has taken something that was obsolete, but they found a new use for it, or actually like, it is obsolete, but I like it. It still works for me. I don't need the latest fancy thing. So play in that world.
Thanks a lot. I believe we've reached the end of the session. It's past 6 o'clock. If you want to get in touch with Julian, I think he has a great website as well from the Near Future Laboratory, so you can get in touch with him. Julian, thank you so much. I'm gonna hit pause on this record here.